Imagine waking up tomorrow and discovering that the United States, China, India, the European Union, Japan, and Russia had all collapsed within the same generation. Not invaded, not defeated in a war, just gone. Their cities abandoned, their governments dissolved, their written languages forgotten so completely that nobody alive could read them anymore. That is essentially what happened around 1200 BC, and we still don't fully understand why. It started with a clay tablet. Archaeologists excavating the ruins of the ancient city of Ugarit cataloged it as RS-18.147. It was a letter written in haste, pressed into wet clay, addressed to the king of Cyprus. The message was desperate. Enemy ships had appeared offshore. The king's cities were burning. His grain stores were gone. His army had been sent away, and he had nothing left to defend himself with. The letter was never sent. It was still sitting in a kiln being fired when Ugarit fell. The city was destroyed so completely that it was never rebuilt. For more than 3,000 years, that tablet lay buried beneath ash and rubble. When archaeologists finally translated it, they realized something strange. The king of Ugarit was not describing an isolated disaster. He was describing the final moments of a catastrophe that had already spread across most of the known world. To understand what was lost, you first need to understand what the Bronze Age world actually looked like. Most people imagine ancient civilizations as isolated and primitive. The reality was very different. In 1982, a Turkish sponge diver discovered a shipwreck near the town of Uluburun off the southern coast of Turkey. The ship had been resting on the seafloor for more than 3,000 years. When archaeologists excavated it, they found something extraordinary. 10 tons of copper from Cyprus, tin from Central Asia, glass ingots from Egypt, ivory, ebony, gold, jewelry, wine jars, and a Mycenaean sword. Goods from at least 7 different civilizations were packed onto a single vessel. The tin alone had traveled more than 4,000 kilometers before reaching the Mediterranean. This was not a primitive world. This was an international economy. The Hittites controlled one of the most powerful kingdoms in Anatolia. Egypt dominated the eastern Mediterranean. The Mycenaean Greeks ruled major sea routes across the Aegean, and cities like Ugarit connected them all together. By the late Bronze Age, no major power stood alone anymore. Everything was connected. Then between roughly 1250 and 1200 BC, that world began to break apart. At first, archaeologists thought they were looking at separate disasters. One city burned here, another kingdom collapsed there. But as more sites were excavated, a pattern emerged. The destruction layers across multiple civilizations were all dating to roughly the same 50-year period. Mycenae, destroyed. Tirans, destroyed. Medea, destroyed. Ugarit, burned. Cyprus, repeatedly attacked. The Hittite capital of Hattusa was abandoned. Even Egypt barely survived. The palace systems that had organized Bronze Age civilization for centuries disappeared. The scribes who maintained official records vanished with them. Entire writing systems died. Linear B, the script used by the Mycenaean Greeks, simply disappears from history. Nobody remained to read it. Nobody remained to teach it. For the next 400 years, written records became astonishingly rare across much of the eastern Mediterranean. Historians call this period the Greek Dark Ages, but the darkness reached far beyond Greece. The ancient Egyptians believed they knew what caused it. Pharaoh Ramesses III described waves of invaders arriving by sea. He called them the Sea Peoples. His inscriptions claimed that no land could stand against them. According to Egyptian records, they swept through cities and kingdoms across the region, leaving destruction behind them. For decades, many historians accepted that explanation. The Sea Peoples invaded, civilizations collapsed, case closed, but the evidence refused to cooperate. Years before those invasions, cracks had already begun appearing in the system. Hittite records contain urgent requests for grain shipments. Harvests were failing, food shortages were spreading, people were already struggling to survive. Then researchers turned to an unexpected source of evidence. Ancient lake sediments. Deep beneath the mud at the bottom of lakes, tiny grains of pollen had been preserved for thousands of years. Those pollen grains allowed scientists to reconstruct ancient climate conditions. What they found was alarming. Beginning around 1250 BC, the eastern Mediterranean entered a prolonged drought. Rainfall declined, rivers shrank, harvests failed, and the drought lasted for decades. Populations that had grown large during centuries of prosperity suddenly faced food shortages. When populations starve, governments weaken. When governments weaken, armies struggle to function. When armies weaken, borders become vulnerable. And when borders become vulnerable, people move. This is where the work of historian Eric Klein becomes important. After years of studying the collapse, he argued that searching for a single cause was a mistake. The Bronze Age world had not been destroyed by one disaster. It had been overwhelmed by many disasters arriving at the same time. A perfect storm. The drought created food shortages. Food shortages shortages fueled unrest. Unrest weakened governments. Weak governments struggled to defend themselves. Large populations began migrating in search of survival. Those migrations collided with already stressed societies. The people Egypt called the Sea Peoples may not have been a single conquering empire at all. Many were likely displaced populations searching for new homes after their own societies had already begun collapsing. The attackers and the attacked were often victims of the same crisis. And there was another problem: earthquakes. Geological studies suggest that several major cities experienced significant seismic activity during this same period. Mycenaean Tyrants. Ugarit. Not every city, not the primary cause, but another source of pressure on a system already under strain. Drought, famine, migration, political instability, raids, earthquakes. No single one of those disasters would necessarily have ended Bronze Age civilization. These societies had survived crises before. What they had never faced was all of them at once. The Bronze Age Mediterranean was highly connected. That connection created immense prosperity. Copper from one region, tin from another, knowledge from another, ships, merchants, diplomats, and farmers all linked together in a network stretching across thousands of kilometers. But the same connections that created prosperity also created vulnerability. When one region failed, others suffered. When trade routes broke down, entire industries collapsed. When food shipments stopped, populations far away felt the consequences. Efficiency had created dependence, and dependence had created fragility. The Uluburun shipwreck is more than an archaeological treasure. It is a snapshot of a world built on connection, a world that worked brilliantly until it didn't. There is one detail from Hattusa that archaeologists still find haunting. When they excavated the city, they found storage jars that still contained grain. Tools remained in workshops. Evidence suggested that many people did not flee during a single dramatic attack. Instead, they left gradually. Imagine being among the last families to leave, walking away from a city your ancestors had lived in for generations, looking back one final time before disappearing into an uncertain future. The Hittites did not vanish in one battle. They simply faded into history, and eventually forest covered the city they left behind. The Bronze Age collapse is not just a story about the past, it is a story about complexity, dependence, and fragility. The unsent letter from Ugarit still exists today. The king who wrote it did not know that neighboring kingdoms were already collapsing. He did not know that entire trade networks were failing. He did not know that the world he depended on was unraveling around him. He only knew that enemy ships were approaching. His grain was gone, his soldiers were gone, and his city was running out of time. So he pressed his message into clay, placed it in a kiln, and never had the chance to send it. 3,200 years later, the tablet survived. The king didn't, his city didn't, his kingdom didn't, but his warning did.